So we have a diversity. I think when most people think of lemurs, they think of that animal, the ring-tailed lemur. But there's over 100 different species of living lemur alive today. So we have mongoose lemurs, we have blue-eyed black lemurs, which are some of the most endangered lemurs that we have at the Lemur Center. These animals, they're different colors for males and females. We also have the cockerel shafak, which is a very charismatic kind of Muppet-like animal that has been part of lots of outreach that we've done, including the PBS kids shows The Boobafoo featured these animals. And they move in this really beautiful balletic way through the forest. And so at the Lemur Center, we have 16 different species currently of lemur. And some of them are able to live in the open habitats that we provide, which are multiple acres of fenced-in forest. Others live in, like the nocturnal animals live in enclosed space. So we basically have them on a flip schedule so that for them, nighttime is our daytime, so our keepers can work on them during the day, and the animals are happy and awake during that time. The Division of Fossil Primates is housed in a building on Broad Street in Durham, which is close to East Campus. Essentially, we got too many fossils and the Lemur Center got too many lemurs in the late 90s. And so the fossils ended up moving into a building that has had many lives. It has been a dentist office. It has been a real estate office. It's been a daycare center. And now it is the largest collection of fossil primates in North America. And it's kind of an unassuming building. And we're in the process of trying to design and then get financial support to move the fossils back to the Lemur Center campus so that the lemurs, so the fossils are actually in the same place as the lemurs. So researchers can kind of toggle back and forth between deep time perspectives and living perspectives without needing to travel the distance between our fossil collection and our living collection. So the Division of Fossil Primates looks like this behind the scenes. In fact, basically our building is behind the scenes. We're primarily a research collection right now. And I'm in the process of designing an exhibit space that I'll show you at the end of the presentation. But it's still really small because we have a lot of material and the cabinets take up most of the space that we have. So it's another reason why we want to build a new facility on the Lemur Center campus that gives us much more space to kind of tell the story of ancient primates while also having plenty of space for our collections. Those collections are right now about 35,000 specimens and growing. And the point is basically to connect lemurs to humans. We're trying to go through this whole story from when the animals that first started to look like primates got started all the way to what we have today in the modern diversity of primates that includes humans. And in order to do that, we have to follow primates on this epic journey around the world. Primates today are primarily found in kind of equatorial regions, but as you'll see as we go through this, they have been all over the place, and keeping track of that journey is a really important part to understanding their larger evolution. The main collections that we have here come from four larger areas. Of course, Madagascar being an important one for understanding the fossil record of lemurs. We also have a really important fossil collection from Egypt, another important collection from Colombia and South America. And then we have United States collections that are from multiple places, including Wyoming, Utah, and North Carolina. This is what the building looks like if you drive by. Like I said, it's very much it's an unassuming building. But inside that highly reflective door is this massive collection that was founded by this man. Elwyn Simons is a very important fossil researcher, paleontologist, who was the founder of the fossil collection here and also the second director of the Duke Lemur Center. He came down to the Lemur Center from Yale because he wanted to study the living lemurs in the forests and understand the biology of lemurs alongside the fossil primates that he was really excited about. And so Elwyn did decades of research in places like the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming and in Egypt and Madagascar, and he really started this collection that I'm now responsible for. Elwyn also is basically the kind of academic grandfather of anyone who studies the evolution of primates. They can somehow connect themselves back to Elwyn. Because really when he was getting started, there was all of this buzz around what Louis Leakey was doing and trying to understand where humans came from, these ideas of starting to look in Africa for bipedal ape ancestors that gave rise to humans. Elwyn wanted to push that a little further back in time. He wanted to say, sure, humans eventually get up on 2 feet, but where did the apes come from? Where did monkeys come from? And pushing that further and further back in time. And in doing so, he trained students to focus on each of those parts of the primate family tree. What Elwyn did with the collection would have been impossible if he hadn't had this man, Pridget Chatrath, who was the collections manager and lead researcher here at the Division of Fossil Primates for the whole time Elwyn was here. And Pridget is a really phenomenal fossil collector and also is responsible for basically running all the field projects that went out looking for fossils. Another important researcher we have at Duke is the man in the lower left here. His name is Rich Kaye. And Rich is a paleoprimatologist who was the first PhD student to work with Elwyn. And he also was at Duke. And he focused on what happened when primates got to South America, because there's this really fascinating radiation of South American primates that basically got there from Africa. So taking the work that Elwyn was doing in Egypt and connecting the dots across the Atlantic Ocean to South America is what Rich worked on. And now we have a lot of the fossils that Rich and his teams collected as part of our collection. And then finally, our collections were grown in basically between 2011 and 2017 by this man, Greg Gunnell. Greg spent most of his career at the University of Michigan, where he worked with a team that focused on this North American story that I'm about to tell you. A lot of the research that I'll talk about really comes from the teams that Greg was a part of. He was fascinated by the early story of primates and also the origins of bats was his other big area of research. And so he was the curator of this collection before I came down to become the next person to take over this beautiful fossil collection. And so with all of that context, we're going to talk about where primates come from. And really that is a taxonomic question. And taxonomy is just the art of what things make other things different from each other. So in the macroscopic scale, there's this big difference that we observe in the organisms around us. For most organisms that we focus on are plants or animals. And of course, the two interact, and there's interaction through all of this that's really important. And what it means to be an animal is that you are mobile and you don't produce your own food, or at least at some point in your reproductive stage, you're mobile. And so needing to acquire food means that one of the things we study, especially in terrestrial animals or animals that are on land, is their locomotion, how they move around. And in primates, that is very focused on how you move around in trees. Because what it means to be a primate is mostly what it means to be a very skilled animal in trees, with humans being a kind of conspicuous failure when it comes to really clambering through the treetops. As we focus into our animals, which include primates, we get in this division between mammals and reptiles. Big difference here when we glance at them has a lot to do with what we see on the outside. But of course, the differences we can see in paleontology are going to be very different because the fossilization of traits we think of as being classically mammal, things like fur, things like live reproduction, or like giving birth to live young, unless you're a platypus or echidna, producing milk, those are all things that obviously don't fossilize very well. So there's a lot of bony traits that we look for when we find mammals in the fossil record that distinguish them from reptiles. Things like having different kinds of teeth throughout your tooth row, reducing the numbers of teeth that you're getting throughout your life. This whole thing with only having one set of baby teeth and then a set of replacing adult teeth is something only mammals do. As you all know from collecting lots and lots of shark teeth, sharks get this great reputation for replacing their teeth throughout their lives, but really everything replaces their teeth throughout their lives. Crocodiles, dinosaurs, everybody uses this very important tool that we keep in our mouths for processing food. And it makes sense to kind of replace it throughout your life, because if a tooth breaks, you don't want to kind of have to suffer through that for the rest of your life. For lots of reasons that we can extract from the fossil record, mammals have restricted the number of teeth that they put in their mouths. And that seems to have spurred this complexity that mammals have in their mouths. They have really complicated teeth, and really complicated teeth and complicated chewing processes are something that we can observe in the fossil record, and ultimately means a lot of the mammal fossil record is dominated by discussion of teeth, because teeth are something that fossilize really well. They're basically rocks that are in our mouths, and they fossilize really well. And because mammals have very complicated teeth, you can tell a lot about a mammal. You can tell its body size. You can usually tell what group, like larger group of animals something might belong to if all you have is a couple of teeth. And so a lot of fossils I'm going to show you in a second are teeth. And the reason for that is because mammals have this really amazing adaptation in having complex teeth. And so it's a big difference between what it means to be a mammal and what it means to be a reptile. Then when we get into mammals, there's obviously big divisions. And one of the divisions that we can think about is what is a primate versus a rodent. And I will break down some of the features that help us identify primates in the fossil record. In the living record, primates have things like complex social behaviors and a behavior that tends to keep them in the trees. But of course, observing where an animal lives by observing its behavior is something that is not very easy to do in the fossil record. So we have to come up with proxies, ways that we can study tree behavior from only having the skeleton or the teeth of an animal. And so looking into the fossil record, of course, there's the geological timescale that we have to contend with. And the fossil record of primates is one that is largely restricted to the Cenozoic. And so starting in the Paleocene is when we find some of the earliest primates. And they start to diversify into the Eocene. So this is kind of the, we'll limit the scope of the timeline that we're interested in here. To look for certain traits that we want to find in the fossil record to know if we're dealing with a primate. So the top here is a skull of a ruffed lemur, which is a really magnificent type of lemur that we have at the Lemur Center. There are black and white ruffed lemurs, and there's red ruffed lemurs. They are united by having a ruff. It's like this kind of like beard that goes across the bottom of their chin to their ears, gives them a really kind of dignified look. But this is what they look like without all their fur, is this skull on the top compared to a gray fox skull here on the bottom. When you look at the skulls of these two animals, they look pretty similar. They have long noses. They even have a canine up front that's really prominent. That canine is something, it's this tooth in the front of the mouth here, can be a little deceptive. When you think of a carnivore, you think of the canine is named for canids, which is a dog. They have really big canines. Wolves have big canines. Saber-toothed cats have crazy long canines. But of course, this is a red-ruffed lemur. Their favorite food is bananas and other kinds of fruit. So what are they doing with this big canine in the front that looks like a fox? Canines, because they're in the front of our mouths, are really useful for social signaling. By flashing your canine, especially if you're a lemur, you can communicate a lot to your neighbors and friends. If you flash them in an aggressive way, you can say, hey, back off, I'm eating here. If there's kind of slightly exposed, you can say like, hey, I'm comfortable hanging out, like come over and join me. And so canines ultimately become kind of a social tool that a lot of animals use canines for. So there are actually long canines in lots of animals that don't eat meat. Instead, meat eating is something that we can observe on the teeth in the back of the jaw in something like a fox or a saber-toothed cat that have kind of blade-like teeth in the back of their mouth, where this lemur has flat kind of smashing teeth that are good for eating the bananas that they love. The other difference between these two animals is right here. This structure in the skull of the ruffed lemur kind of connects the top of the skull to the tooth row. Is called a post-orbital bar. And that post-orbital bar is something that all primates have. And you'll observe below, the fox doesn't have that bar. Most mammals don't have this post-orbital bar. And so finding that is something that gives us a lot of confidence that we've found in the fossil record. If we find this bar, we know we're dealing most likely with a primate. If we look at the rest of the skeleton, this is the hand of a ruffed lemur compared to the hand of a fox. One big difference between these organisms is the presence of a thumb. Having a thumb that can kind of rotate in is something that's really useful if you want to grip onto a tree. If you want to run on the ground really efficiently, having a thumb sticking out can kind of get in the way. And so the fox has these more elongate fingers that kind of bundle together, almost like kind of bundle of sticks or something to help them get up on their toes. A primate, on the other hand, literally has a thumb that's sticking off to the side that helps them grip onto things. And if we find an organism that has a thumb, either on its hand or an opposable big toe, we know that we are most likely dealing with a primate. There's a couple of exceptions to that. There's some possums that have thumbs. But in general, if you find a thumb and a post-orbital bar, you know that you have found a fossil primate. You can even find just a single finger bone, ideally the end of the finger bone, to tell if you have a primate. Because a flattened end to the finger indicates the presence of a fingernail. Fingernails are these things that we all have that are one of the things that all primates have. This is a key primate trait, and it's one of the things that makes us primates. It is basically what in the fox, the end part of their finger is kind of compressed into a claw-like bone that then gives shape to the fingernail that grows over top of it, that gives it the kind of curved claw that you think of as what's at the end of the paws of a dog or a cat or a squirrel. Instead, in us, of course, we have big flat nails that cover our big flat fingers. These big flat fingers, coupled with our thumb, make for really, really good, strong precision gripping that lets us grip onto things like tree trunks and twigs that ultimately give primates the ability to really kind of be superheroes in the treetops. And that is something we can actually find in the fossil record if we find parts of the hand bones of a primate. So this is a schematic of the primate family tree. And lemurs, like I said, are one of the earlier branching groups of what we think of as primates. And then humans are part of this other group that we call apes. And in between, there's lots of other types of primates that have broken off and gone on their own evolutionary journeys. And these divergences are basically targets for paleoanthropologists. We want to figure out where and when did each of these major lineages of primates break off from the rest of the kind of trunk of the primate family tree, and kind of what leads to this diversity that we find in primates around us that ultimately comes down to how humans became the primates that we are. So going way back in time to the end of the age of dinosaurs and into the Paleocene, we want to go on a hunt for the earliest primates. And in the Paleocene, we find the fossils of organisms that look very primate-like, but don't have all of the features that I just talked about. We can also study the living record by looking at genetic evidence for what are the closest relatives of primates among mammals today. And so if you do that, if you go out and kind of collect DNA or proteins or really any genetic information from lots of organisms that have fur and produce milk and have complicated chewing teeth, you'll find that the big group that is most closely related to primates is the group called gliries. And gliries are the rodents and the rabbits. These are all united by having like big front teeth that are that sharpen themselves against each other and let rodents be really the most diverse group of mammals that exist today. There's about 6,000 species of mammals that are alive today. Half of all mammal diversity are rodents. So it's a very successful way to make a living, is to look like a rodent with these kind of chiseled teeth in the front of your face. Rabbits are much less diverse than rodents. But that is like the big group that's most closely related to us. But our closest cousins include a group of animals that are called tree shrews, which are not shrews, despite their name. Tree shrews are the primate-like animals that lack a post-orbital bar. They also don't have opposable thumbs, and they don't have gripping fingernails. Instead, they have a couple of features in their brain and in their eyeballs that seem very primate-like, that when researchers in the early 20th century or late 19th century were trying to figure out what the closest relatives of primates were, tree shrews were kind of a prime candidate. But genetic evidence has really solidified the position of tree shrews as a close relative of primates. Another group of animals that comes in as kind of a close relative of primates is this group of animals called Kalugos. And I like to use the word Kalugo for these things because their other common name is the flying lemur, which is a really tough nickname for these guys because they can't fly. They can glide really, really, really well. They can't fly, and they're not lemurs. They look lemur-like, but they are their own group of animals that live in Southeast Asia, particularly places like the Philippines, where they glide from tree to tree, and they are amazing at gliding. You can see this animal kind of spread out in full gliding mode. And they have this stretch of skin that's called a patagium that is basically every surface that can have all of this webbing to be part of their gliding membrane is. So you have like a gliding that goes membrane that goes all the way to the tip of their tail. Their feet and fingers are webbed so that they can be part of the gliding membrane. And then there's this big flap of skin that goes from basically their chin, like their jawline, out to their wrist that makes this really massive gliding surface. And so when they land on trees, they look a little bit like a collapsed umbrella because they have all this extra skin that they have to deal with. They look really awkward actually as they climb around in the woods. But then when they take flight, it all makes sense because they open this massive gliding membrane up. And they demonstrate why they, people taking a glance at them and seeing them kind of zipping through the forest might think of them as flying lemurs. And these animals are closely related to primates, but are not themselves primates because, again, they don't have a bar behind their eyeball, and they don't have thumbs, and they don't have fingernails. When we go into the fossil record, we find evidence of animals that do start to have some of the traits that we associate with primates. And the big group that includes like our closest primate, but not quite primate relatives, are this group of animals called Plesiadapiforms. And the Plesiadapiform fossil record is really, really good, especially in North America. A lot of what we understand about this early group of primate-like mammals comes from right here. And in this reconstruction of this animal, who's called Carpalestis, you can see that it's gripping with its feet because it has a big opposable toe on its back foot. And it's starting to get, it has a fingernail that it has on some of those digits. But most importantly, it has a gripping foot. And it lacks a couple of important features, though. It doesn't have a post-orbital bar quite yet. It has some weird looking teeth. Their teeth have like this big kind of blade-like premolar that animals like rat kangaroos today have that seem to be just kind of like a Swiss Army knife of a tooth that are used for slicing into fruit, into wood shavings if you need to go after bugs. That can crack open a seed if you need to. And then they also have these front teeth that are very reminiscent of what we see in something like a rabbit or a rodent. And so this combination of features tells us that they're not quite primates yet, but they're getting darn close because the way that they move through the trees would have been very primate-like, using an opposable big toe, and there would have been a toenail on that big toe while there were claws on the other parts of the foot. And so you give it a little bit of time and that body plan eventually becomes something that looks a little bit more like a primate. These Plesiadapiforms were found across the northern continents about 60 million years ago. So they're found in places like Asia, Europe, and in North America. And then when we go into our kind of like larger primate record, the Plesiadapiforms basically plug in like where the word primates is in this tree. And then a couple million years later, after the Plesiadapiforms arrived on the scene, you get the arrival of true primates that have all of those features that I was talking about. And those true primates have spread across the northern continents in the same places that we found things like the Plesiadapiforms. 55 million years ago, you would have been able to go primate hunting with binoculars and a camera in Asia, Europe, and in North America. Note that none of these animals have gotten into the southern continents yet. Primates start as kind of a northern continent story. And the fossil record for the northern continents in places like Asia and in Europe is really, really patchy. The Asian fossil record, you can find like little pockets of rock that preserve fossils from this time period. Europe is basically a Caribbean-like island chain that has shallow seas connecting all these big islands that were parts of France and parts of Germany. And it makes it really hard to kind of figure out the sequence of when different fossils were deposited. The best place to look for fossils from this time period, from the early Eocene into the middle Eocene, is in North America. And so here's a geological map of North America that should look a little bit familiar. And as you know, the lighter the color is, the more recent it is. And so the colors that we're looking for that zoom in on the early primate record are these like dark oranges and yellows that we see. And where a whole lot of dark yellow and orange pops up is in the western part of North America, because this is really just convenient case of the Rocky Mountains that got pushed up around the time of the end of the age of dinosaurs. And as mountains get pushed up, they erode. And as they erode, they form basins. And those basins are basically where rivers and streams bring all the sediment that's basically like breaking the mountains down into their component parts again. And along those stream banks and river banks is where we get the deposition of fossils on land. And so we're kind of dependent on where wandering riverways were in the past to tell us where to find fossils in the present. And so the Badlands of Western North America are especially well layered because we have the Rocky Mountains that built up and then are eroding at exactly the time period when early primates were getting a start after the extinction of dinosaurs. This Western interior North American world 55 million years ago is very lush. It is a world of, in the background, you can see the Rocky Mountains kind of pushing up. And this is supposed to be kind of an image of what southwestern Wyoming would have looked like 55 million years ago. And so prominently in the foreground here is one of these lemur-like primates that first got its start here in North America. In the background, you can see things like this ancient relative of artiodactyls, which is the even-toed ungulates, the group that includes deer and camels and cows. Living alongside them would have been early perissodactyls, which are the odd-toed ungulates. Those are things like horses and rhinos and tapirs. And then off to the side here is this early carnivore and carnivorous mammals that are extinct today. They're called hyaenid meat-eating mammal that we don't have anymore. That was part of this kind of lush, almost tropical world that would have been great for early primates living in North America. Those early primates that we find are divided into two main groups. The groups of primates we find in the early Eocene are adipoforms. Adipoforms are, right now we think, on the lineage that includes lemurs, which is the Strepsirrhine line, if you want to get technical. Strepsirrhines are the group that includes lemurs and a couple of lorises and Kalugos, which are animals that are not found in Madagascar. These adipoforms are thought to be close relatives of lemurs. And as you can see from the reconstruction here of this animal called Netharctis, the adipoforms looked a lot like a lemur. Like there's a reason why the Duke Lemur Center exists as a place to study early primates, is because adipoforms don't look all that different from living lemurs. There's a lot of connections to be made. On the other hand, there's this group of animals called Omumayas. And Omumayas, as far as we can tell, are more closely related to monkeys and to tarsiers, which is a group of primates that I'll show you in a second, that are still alive today, but they're these big-eyed kind of nocturnal animals that are more closely related genetically, we know, to monkeys than they are to lemurs. And so this split between the lemur line and the monkey line is something we already have in the fossil record of North America 55 million years ago. And the adipoforms are really abundant. They are really easy to find because they seem to be larger. They have a much larger body size than the Omumayas. And there are beautiful skeletons of these animals. This is a skeleton in Netharctis that is sitting 15 feet away from me right now. And this is a mounted skeleton of Smilodectes, which is another North American animal that I'll show you in our prep lab. Omumayas are really interesting, partially because they are more closely related to us than they are to lemurs. And recently have become really fascinating to me because we now have a record of Omumayas from Eastern North America. In May of this year, so May 2021, there's a paper that came out that described a Omumayid from Virginia that was discovered in the Nanjemoy Formation. And this is what the specimen looks like. It's just this pair of teeth that are tiny. They are like 2 millimeters across. This site is kind of early Eocene, bordering on earliest Eocene. And it is in, some of you may be familiar and have done some work in the Nanjemoy. It's in northeastern Virginia. And this is a map from a paper that kind of describes the rest of the fauna. It's primarily a marine fauna. It's lots of beautiful Eocene sharks and rays and early whales that are found in these sites. And there is a primate that somehow got washed out to sea. This specimen was discovered by an amateur fossil collector who was working at what's called the Fisher-Sullivan site in northeastern Virginia. And he had his sit out and was going through a screen wash and noticed this glint of enamel and didn't recognize, he wasn't sure what it was. He knew it was teeth of something and it didn't look like a fish. And he did a little research and hypothesized that it was a small mammal and possibly a primate. So he got in touch with the Smithsonian, which is the closest natural history museum if you're in northeastern Virginia. And there he was connected with a researcher named Ken Rose. Ken Rose was a student who also worked with Elwyn when Elwyn was at Yale. And Ken is an expert in these early primates. He's an expert really in all early mammals. And he worked with the fossil collector to then describe this thing. And it turns out that it is the only known, or so far the first primate known from the Atlantic coast of North America. There were definitely primates that were living here. We know that the Appalachian Mountains were definitely above water. It's just we don't have the same depositional environments that we have in other parts of the world to preserve their full fossil record. So this is mostly to say, keep an eye out for really, really small teeth if you're working in Eocene rock, because it is possible that primates can get washed out to sea and be discovered in some of these sites where mostly you're finding very marine ecosystems. And so this is also a paper, image from that paper, or a paper that describes the shark fauna. That shows the Fisher-Sullivan site here, kind of along what was the Atlantic coast of North America during the early Eocene. Places like Florida and parts of southern United States were flooded. We don't have a connection between North and South America. And this star represents like the next, like the sites that are deposited in the interior that are about the same age as the Fisher-Sullivan site. And so that is where I want to take you now, because if you want to find lots of primates, you got to go to the Rocky Mountain West because of this accident of the Rocky Mountains being uplifted in just the right way at just the right time. And then those rocks getting uplifted again as the Rocky Mountains continue to rumble, exposing these as beautiful badlands where we can find lots of primates. And so the Omumayas from northeastern Virginia is thought to be a close relative of an animal called Tehardenia, which is from the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming. So the Bighorn Basin is kind of in like the northwestern, north central-ish part of Wyoming. It is maybe like an hour and a half, 2-hour drive from Yellowstone, which is over here. And the Bighorn Basin has been studied for decades, century at this point, as kind of the cradle of primates. This is where the oldest North American primates are discovered. And it's become a really fascinating place to work in the last couple of years because it captures the Paleocene-Eocene boundary. And what was happening at the Paleocene-Eocene boundary was the world was incredibly warm. If you think back to that picture I showed you, this kind of lush hothouse world that was the western interior of North America, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum looks climatologically a lot like what the modern world is projected to look like by the year 2100, given the current influx of CO2 going into the atmosphere. And so there's been a lot of research trying to look at what does this rapidly warming world look like in the fossil records. It's become a really important kind of window for us to understand the modern world, despite being deposited 55 million years ago. Another important site in Wyoming is in the southwestern corner called the Bridger Basin. The Bridger Basin is younger than the Bighorn Basin. This is a Middle Eocene outcrop. And so the animals that we find in the Bighorn Basin kind of grow up into the things that we find in the Bridger Basin. And the Bridger Basin is when we find kind of a fully diverse primate ecosystem. I like to say it's basically the Madagascar of North America. So when we have lots of different species of lemur-like primates that were living all in North America, and we find beautiful specimens of them in the Bridger Basin. And so, so far, a lot of my field work that I've been leading has been to the Bridger Basin to study kind of the flourishing of primates. And I've collaborated with researchers on the Bighorn Basin project, but a lot of that is led by researchers from the University of Florida and the University of Michigan, whereas Duke is kind of leading the Bridger Basin project. And so here's video of the last field season, which unfortunately was in 2019, and we haven't been able to go back out since. But we really have, at least I have all my fingers and toes crossed for 2022. This is going out to the outcrop. It is this beautiful kind of layer cake of material that represents the flooding events of these hundreds of braided rivers and streams that flowed out of the Rocky Mountains. One of my colleagues is prospecting for fossils out there, and you can kind of see each of these layers built on top of each other. When we zoom in on what those rocks actually look like up close, I'm sitting on top of the outcrop. Here over my corner, over my shoulder is the Uinta Mountains, which are also part of this Rocky Mountain uplift. As they erode and fill the basin, but basically I'm sitting on top of the rubble of the Uintans and the Rockies. It is this really loosely consolidated mud, sand, and siltstone that when exposed on the surface is this really pebbly kind of material that becomes a nightmare when it rains because it's just goopy. And that means that there's lots of erosion that happens really quickly and exposes lots and lots of fossils. The erosion is really, really rapid. And so you can go back to the same site year after year after year and find new things every time because of the amount of rain and everything. These are two of my collaborators from Duke, Doug Boyer and his grad student, Madison. And this is John Alexander. He's a researcher from the Burke Museum in Seattle. And he is an expert on finding these outcrops that contain things like this. This is the skull of a primate, Smilodectes to be specific. It's one of these adapiform primates. It's this part of the head of this primate that is exposed on the surface. We then got down and crawled the surface and identified skeletal elements of this animal. So we found the skull kind of exposed and encased in rock. We found parts of its ankle and parts of its tail, which suggested that between the ankle and the tail and the head, we might have the entire skeleton preserved. And so in order to get the whole skeleton, the rock surrounding it has kept it safe for 50 million years. And so we don't want to mess with a good thing. And so we want to remove the entire block from this outcrop and then bring it back to the lab here where we can more patiently remove it. And so actually excavating this block takes a lot of time and effort because the rock itself wasn't exposed on the surface, an easy way to get to. So we had to kind of trench underneath it. Eventually it popped out. Fortunately, there weren't any major rainstorms or hailstorms during that time to kind of knock things over. I will actually, this is a video walking into the collection. I'll show you what this looks like in just a second. But the block is now safely back here at the Duke Lemur Center, where we're removing the specimens that are inside of it. The Bighorn Basin, of course, the Bridger Basin has lots of other fossils to be discovered. The upper right corner is the jaw of one of these early tapirs. It would have been about the size of a pig. In the lower right is this really exciting skull that was emerging from the rock that we found basically like the day before a massive hailstorm. It definitely would have just destroyed this thing. And so we packed it up really quickly and I hiked it out on my backpack. This is an animal called Metacairones, which is actually a close relative, we think, of pangolins. Pangolins are these really cool kind of artichoke crossed with an anteater. If you want to look them up real quick, they're really magnificent little animals. And they are genetically most closely related to things like dogs, cats, bears, and other carnivores. And so finding this early kind of relative of pangolins and kind of a distant cousin of early carnivores was a really exciting discovery to go alongside a lot of these primates that we were finding. Then, of course, we want to get to the actual lemur part of the family tree. And that part doesn't happen in North America. What it means to be kind of a modern strepsirrhine or a modern lemur is to have this really interesting adaptation on the front of your face called a tooth comb. A tooth comb is kind of the smashing together of your canines and your incisors into this structure that lemurs use to kind of like clean their fur. Seems to be the main thing they use it for. They also have one claw on their foot, like basically one of their fingernails kind of reverted back to being this kind of compressed thing that they use again for like picking at their fur and cleaning themselves. And so true lemurs are something that don't happen in North America. None of the animals that we find in the Bridger Basin have tooth combs and they don't have grooming claws. Instead, to find that part of the story, we have to follow lemurs out of the northern continents and they get down into Africa. So we think about 50 million years ago, there was a dispersal across this seaway called the Tethys Seaway that used to go between Africa and Eurasia. That was traversed by Omumayas-like primates and by adapiform-like primates. And it was in Africa that the Omumaya group gave rise to true monkey-like primates we call anthropoids, and that the adapiform-like animals gave rise to things that are lemurs. And it's a good thing that the monkey-like and the lemur-like primates managed to get out of the north because those animals make their way to Madagascar, or at least the lemur-like primates do. Meanwhile, in the north, all of the primates go extinct. And so after millions of years of a really happy run in Europe and Asia and in North America, primates go extinct in the north. And if they hadn't made this journey from the north into Africa, primates probably would have just gone extinct at the end of the Oligocene, or like in the late Eocene, early Oligocene, which is really kind of traumatic time period for a lot of ecosystems across the northern continents. And primates are kind of casualty of that. In order to understand the extinction of primates in North America, there's another field project that the Lemur Center is a part of that is in south central Utah. So this is a kind of a schematized geological map of Utah. And in the south central part is the Bryan Head Formation, which is a mid to late Eocene and maybe earliest Oligocene outcrop of rock that really hasn't been very thoroughly explored for fossil reasons. But there are a couple of tantalizing fossils that tell us that it was a relatively lush environment that would have been a happy place for a primate to be if there are primates to be discovered. And so this project, I just got started in the summer of 2019, and we haven't been able to go back since. But this is what the Bryan Head Formation looks like. It's really beautiful. There's kind of reds and pinks and greens and whites and blue rock that are all layered on top of each other. And this is me crouching by a very small jaw of an animal called an Anthracothere. Anthracotheres are kind of like hippo pigs, like they're lanky hippos that are found all over the world. And they tend to be found in the same kind of forested or jungly ecosystems where you can find primates. So finding the jaw of an Anthracothere is a really exciting thing to encourage further research into this site and maybe find some of the last primates that lived in North America. It's also just a fun place to work because it is so damn pretty. And so in these rocks, we are hoping to collect lots and lots of material that we bring back here for screen washing here at the Duke Lemur Center. We'll need a lot of volunteers to help process that material to pick to find the tiny little primates that might have been among the last to live in North America. But then, of course, the Lemur Center wants to follow the primates from the north into the south. So we need to get back to Africa. And that is what this work in the Fayum Depression of Egypt is focused on. So now this is the Western Sahara of Egypt, or the Western Desert of Egypt, the eastern part of the Sahara Desert, which is just this open, basically sandbanks. This is the formation or the area where Basilosaurus and Dorodon are found, these really gorgeous whales that come from places like Northern Africa and also are found in places like Alabama and parts of North Carolina. Of course, because it's Egypt, there's other kinds of ancient history preserved on top of all of this. So you're prospecting for fossils alongside archaeologists who are looking at the human record. In fact, in some of the tombs that are burrowed into the Fayum, there are actually fossils kind of exposed on the walls of the tombs themselves. And interestingly, the area by the Fayum was the city that was built up along this oasis in Egypt is called Crocodilopolis, or the city of the crocodile. And the kind of mythological story of it is the Fayum oasis had lots of crocodiles, but then going out into the desert, there were lots of fossil crocodiles that were eroding from the rock, and they crocodile kind of, I've seen plenty of them, dozens of them, like out in the desert, that are slowly coming up. They're Eocene crocodiles that definitely look really old, and led to a mythological story that Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of the Nile, was born in the Fayum, and his ancestors were these ancient rock crocodiles that then gave rise to the Nile River. And they're not that wrong. There were very ancient crocodiles living in a massive river that flowed to the coast of northern Africa. That would have been a very lush environment, or kind of a mangrove swamp that had crocodiles living in it, and also some of the earliest primates, or earliest monkey-like primates that we find in Africa, things like this animal here. Alongside it were things like Arsenotherium, which is this actually elephant relative that looks a little bit like a rhino because it has these horns on its head. more elephant-like proboscideans, like this paleomastodon in the background, stork-like water birds, bats, manatees, and giant hyraxes and all kinds of cool African mammals that were living in this continent that was cut off from the rest of the world that primates happen to get into by kind of drifting across the ocean. If you're going into the fossil record and you're looking for a monkey-like relative, the difference between a strepsirrhine or a lemur-like animal is everybody has this post-orbital bar, so you can kind of feel your post-orbital bar here along the side of your eyeball. But then behind your eyeball is a thing called a post-orbital plate, and that post-orbital plate or post-orbital closure is basically what gives us an eye socket. And having an eye socket is something that only monkey-like primates have. And so in the fossil record of the Fayoum are some of the first or oldest primates that have this total closure behind their eyeballs that tells us things like Eohippus, this monkey that we find in the deserts of Egypt, was a distant relative of all old world monkeys and apes because it has this post-orbital closure. Living alongside Eohippus and our kind of eye socket bearing monkey-like relatives were animals like Paleopropithecus, which is an early lemur-like primate that was living in Egypt because lemurs had to get from Africa to Madagascar. And so this is actually a eye-like animal. Eye-eyes are this really, really fascinating group of lemurs shown in the upper right here that have all these amazing adaptations for basically being lemur woodpeckers. They have ever-growing front teeth that let them burrow into the bark to go after the larvae of insects and also go after eggs that they find, and they kind of like or burrow into the tree to even go after just fiber of the pulp itself. They use their ears, their kind of huge bat-like ears, to listen for the scratching of bugs inside the bark, and they use these super long fingers as tools that they kind of use to like skewer bugs in their nests and eat them off their fingers and make a living eating bugs like that. We find a animal, Paleopropithecus, in the fossil record of Egypt about 34 million years ago that had this really, really long front tooth, and its back teeth look a whole lot like eye teeth. And so it tells us that these lemur-like animals got their start in mainland Africa, and then from Africa make their way to Madagascar sometime between 34 million and like 20 million years ago. The 20 million jaw here is actually a fossil eye relative that was found in the Miocene of Kenya that tells us a lot of the eye story. Despite being a really amazing animal that's only found in Madagascar today, has a lot of its evolutionary story wrapped up in the world of Africa before it arrives in Madagascar. It arrived in Madagascar alongside lots of other animals that live in Madagascar today that are only found there, which is things like this cool kind of punk hedgehog at the top, which is a tenrec. Tenrecs, there's one kind of tenrec that lives in mainland Africa, and the rest are all found in Madagascar. The fossa is this group of carnivorous mammals that are actually more closely related to meerkats than they are to cats, but they are kind of the apex predators in Madagascar. There's a specialized group of rodents that got to Madagascar, and of course the lemurs get to Madagascar. And they all get across the Mozambique Channel when Madagascar was already an island between 40 and 20 million years ago. The problem is that Madagascar doesn't have a great fossil record, which is part of the reason why a lot of the research I do at the Lemur Center focuses on North America, is because in Madagascar, we have a late Cretaceous fossil record, and then we have a marine fossil record from basically the Cenozoic, but then we don't get a good terrestrial record from Madagascar until about 20,000, and really doesn't get good until about 12,000 years ago. And so that is like the end of the Ice Age and basically like modern Madagascar. What's really amazing about that time is we find a crazy diversity of lemurs that were living not that like centuries ago. We had giant gorilla-sized lemurs living in the trees of Madagascar. So this is what some of these giant lemurs would have looked like. There were pygmy hippopotamus living in the water, monkey-like lemurs living on the land, and these giant kind of gorilla and koala and sloth-like lemurs that climb through the trees. And I'll show you some of those in the collection. And so that kind of gets us up to the modern world. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to ask if, I know I've kind of run up to my hour. If you guys have questions, and if you do, I'll try to answer some of those by going into the fossil collection that we have. So with that, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully you learned a little bit about the primate fossil record right here in North America and some of our oldest relatives.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was fantastic. I will ask anyone who has a question to go ahead and unmute themselves and or to put it in chat, whatever you prefer.
I'd like him to talk for another hour.
Oh, no, I don't. Well, thank you, but I won't inflict that now.
This is Charlie Causey. I have a question, if I might.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay. Madagascar was already an island when some of the lemurs and other early animals that you're studying arrived there. What's the best guess as to how they got from the mainland of Africa over to Madagascar?
That is a very, very good question, and a great excuse for me to show you the exhibit space that we're working on. So this is the draft of, so actually, our front door of the Division of Fossil Primates. And so there's Broad Street. Then you'll walk in here and you'll see an exhibit that we're slowly piecing together. And so we have some display cabinets and we have some of our exciting Malagasy specimens. But also importantly, we have some infographics that we're designing to help tell some of these stories. And so I'm going to try to use this one that we put together to kind of tell the story of how primates got around the world from continents that were not connected. And a working hypothesis is basically they drifted there on natural rafts. This is a phenomenon that we see in the modern world where primates especially love to live in kind of mangrove swamps and along the margins of estuaries because there's lots of fruit, there's lots of great trees to climb around in. When you have something like a cyclone or a hurricane or tsunami, you get a storm surge. And what happens to these mangroves is with the storm surge, it'll actually break off pieces of the mangrove and then suck them out to sea, forming natural rafts. Sometimes animals get trapped on those rafts. And so people have observed natural rafts drifting in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that have been kind of thrown out of the Amazon or thrown out of the Congo or the Zambezi, just any major river system that you have that gets these kind of storm surges. And people have observed primates and rodents living on rafts out in the middle of the ocean. And so the working hypothesis is that that is how you did it, is you basically, primates accidentally kind of got blasted out of their home on one side of a continental margin, and they drifted and eventually made it to the other side. And that seems like kind of a crazy, far-fetched idea. It seems really improbable. But given enough time, perhaps it was more probable. We have lots of evidence of animals besides primates making journeys like that. Insects and reptiles and birds all disperse, we think, in a very similar way, or at least some of them do, from island to island or continent to continent. And so primates are just another small organism that this happens to sometimes. The distance between mainland Africa and Madagascar is about 300 kilometers. And so it's only a couple of days of drifting. And so if you have a pregnant female or if a group, like a family that would make sense because they're primates living together, were able to make it across the ocean. If there's enough food on that natural island, then they can find land. There's a really spectacular video that I should send a link to for you guys that I saw of one of these storm surges then sucking out a whole bunch of foliage from down the Panama Canal, or like from a river in Panama, excuse me. And it goes under a bridge that's built across this river. And there's trees that are standing up on it. It's probably like 150 yards long, like the river, and it's maybe, or like the raft, and it's like 50 yards across. It's huge. And the trees that are in it go under the bridge, and they're too tall, and they snap as they go under the bridge. And the canopy of the tree is all snapped, but like the trunk is still standing upright, which is indicative of like how much soil is actually preserved. Like it's just a forest that happens to float. And that seems to be a mechanism that lots of animals used. And that seems to be how the primates got from Eurasia to Africa. They needed to drift, and then they had to drift again from Africa to Madagascar. And then even crazier is primates and rodents drifted from Africa to South America. So that story is kind of told here. So we have these like maps of kind of the Eurasian to African drift. Then you have the Africa to South America drift, where you get primates and rodents make that journey. The primates and rodents we find in the earliest record of South America look exactly like the primates and rodents we find in the Fayoum. So it's kind of eerie, like how little they change. Like there's nothing like it living in North America, nothing like it living in Eurasia. There's like this direct connection between Africa and South America when we know they were like 1,000 kilometers away from each other. So they drifted. That's a long way to answer that. But it's a real mechanism in evolution, especially in the Cenozoic, when all the continents are really spread out. And you get these kind of independent experiments in being different kinds of organisms on these big land masses. Australia is still isolated. South America was isolated. Africa was isolated. North America was isolated. And Eurasia was isolated. And in each of those places, animals are diversifying and kind of exchanging between those every now and then in this big natural experiment of evolution. That's really exciting.
Thank you very much. One follow-up. At the time those earliest lemurs got to Madagascar, would Madagascar have been any closer to Africa at that time?
Not much. Madagascar it's interesting actually. Madagascar broke off from mainland Africa about 85 million years ago. And so that's like the end of the age of dinosaurs. It breaks up 130 million years ago. Then it is connected to India. And Madagascar, India is kind of a continent, but then India breaks away from Madagascar. Madagascar, for some reason, just stalls out and kind of stays where it was. But India like gets this rocket blast and moves all the way across the Indian Ocean, and eventually slams into Asia. And the Himalaya mountains are the result of India not really putting the brakes on before it smashes into Asia. So it is a little bit of a tectonic mystery why India had so much momentum and Madagascar didn't. But it really stayed in place it's been where it is for like tens of millions of years.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Terry.
Okay. Okay. Since you started out talking about the primates in North America early on, and and later on they seem to be everywhere else. What actually happened to all the lines of primates in North America? Why did they all disappear?
So the working hypothesis is that the end of the Eocene, early part of the Oligocene, is basically when we enter a modern climatic world. It's when ice ages start, essentially. And the reason for that is Antarctica has finally kind of slid. Antarctica used to be part of Gondwana, which is South America, Madagascar, Africa, India, Australia. The end of the age of dinosaurs, those are all starting to break apart. And the early age of mammals, they're getting further and further away from each other. Antarctica is drifting further and further south. And it finally gets to basically underneath the globe. And when it gets down there, there is what's called the Circum-Antarctic current starts, which is basically the ocean currents that just go all the way around Antarctica. That basically becomes an air conditioner for the world. All of that, what used to be kind of warm air coming down like the Gulf Stream like does today, we have warm air that comes up from the cold areas, goes across the equator, gets warm, and that's the reason why like Europe is kind of nicely bathed in warm air. You can be in places that are essentially Saskatchewan, like if you look at a map, like how far north Europe really is because there's this exchange of warm air that's coming up from the equatorial regions and then dropping itself into the polar regions. In Antarctica, that doesn't happen. You get this kind of cold air that's constantly cycling around the bottom of the planet. And that brings in, it just makes cold air colder, 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 colder. It makes the water colder too. That seems to have really dropped the average temperature of the entire planet by bringing on a lot of ice sheets that start to form in Antarctica. Ice sheets start to form in the north. And when that happens, you're sucking a lot of moisture out of the whole globe. And that is when we see kind of like a drying ecosystem across the northern continents. This is when the first grasslands start to develop. And so all of these lush jungle-like environments that need lots of humidity, lots of water, start to dry up. And so it seems like basically habitats that primates like are very lush, jungle-y environments. They used to be something that went very, very far north. In the Eocene, there are alligators living in like Greenland, essentially. Like it is a warm, warm world. And sea levels are also very high. At the Eocene Oligocene boundary, all of that sea levels drop. The world gets drier and colder. And the primates go extinct because you start to get open grasslands. And that's when you start to see larger horses start to develop and larger artiodactyls start to develop. Animals that are grassland adapted creatures start to develop around the world. And primates don't do that. Instead, they just kind of went extinct. And it seems like rodents kind of come in and fill in a lot of the ecological space that used to be occupied by primates. Things like squirrels really take off with the extinction of primates.
Thank you.
That was my question, so moving on.
Okay. Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And like I said, trying to figure out the timing of that, like who was the last primate? There's one primate that is in the late Oligocene of North America that's been found in Oregon and in northern Texas. But it looks like it's really closely related to things that we find in Asia. And there's kind of a constant flux of things between North America and Asia being exchanged. So the working hypothesis is this like outlier thing from the late Oligocene is an Asian arrival that isn't connected to North America. But it is an animal who has an amazing name that I always hesitate to pronounce. It's Eohippus, which is a Lakota word that I definitely missed some syllables in, but it is an amazing little hanger-on or an arrival. And so part of this Utah project is trying to basically figure out, like, do we have Eohippus in South Central Utah, like, or its relatives, or do we see, like, what is the last primate that was in North America before everything went extinct? We don't have a great perspective on that slice of geological history. And so that's part of the reason it's really frustrating work, because the primates are by definition rare because they're going extinct. So trying to find them is going to take a while.
Matt, this is Trish. One of the things that I noticed so much on the comparison between the flying lemur, in Florida we have flying squirrels, and they're so similar to those, and that was just sort of interesting to see that comparison between the two of them. That's all.
Yeah, no, the gliding adaptations it's really amazing how often it seems to happen that flying lemurs can glide. Flying squirrels, there are actually multiple lineages of rodents that have all figured out how to fly. So there's the flying squirrels that we have in North America. The scaly-tailed flying squirrel is a thing that lives in Africa that is as distantly related to the flying squirrels that we have in North America as a camel is from a white-tailed deer, which is distant, in case that is a weird comparison to make. But it seems like rodents and lots of mammals kind of get this like flap of skin. And of course, the most important kind of gliding that then became a flying animal was bats. That bats got this gliding membrane and then managed to get powered flight. And trying to figure out how and where and when bats managed to fly while so many other animals managed only to glide is really a big question, and one that we just don't have the fossil record for right now, but it is an area that, like, there are a couple of holy grails of like paleomammalogy. And I'd say one of them is like the early like flying squirrel-like bat. Because the earliest bat skeletons that we have are just bats. Like they're powered flight as far as we can tell. And they pop up all over the world kind of all at once. Like they did it and they just made it work right away. So anyway, bats, flying squirrels, scaly-tailed squirrels, gliding all over the place.
Thanks.
Behind me, by the way, is one of these kind of like tiny horses that we find in the Bridger Basin and the Bighorn Basin. It's a terrier-sized animal called Herakletherium. Herakletherium means hyrax beast. Hyraxes are these animals that are found in Africa. It's like a rabbit-sized creature that like looks just kind of like a grumpy furry football, which is in the wild today. But one of the things they have are these big incisors at the front of their mouths and kind of forward-facing eyes that ultimately connect them based on their bones. And then later genetic evidence confirmed this, that hyraxes are the closest relatives of things like elephants and manatees. And so this is a hyrax here. And its closest relative, elephant, manatee, and then things like aardvarks. So it's interesting that these early hyraxes were initially, like when people found early horses, thought maybe they looked like hyraxes, and trying to figure out like how hyraxes and horses were related to each other was a big project. So if you have heard of like Eohippus is a close relative of Herakletherium, but it's always a little, that Herakletherium means hyrax beast and not horse beast. It's kind of interesting. So yeah, I guess one thing to show you is actually some real fossils, because I can, because this is the not being able to see all of you in person is a real bummer, but we'll take advantage of it because I can actually bring all of you into the collection in a way that would be really hard to do. But inside this cabinet is the most complete Netharctus skeleton that's ever been discovered. It's in 3 different blocks. This is the hind limb. So those long bones are the femur and the shin. Then this is the backbone section with the tail kind of curving towards the bottom of the screen from the hips, and the ribs are preserved there. And then the upper arm bones are here. And nested in the middle of the upper arm bones was the skull. And so this is the skull of Netharctus. It's been smashed, it's deformed from kind of sediment load, smushed it down. But you can see behind the eyeball is that post-orbital bar.
Oh, yeah.
Tells us that we're dealing with a primate. The hand bones for this thing are also recovered, so we can find it has fingernails, it has the opposable thumb. And then another thing that we found is back here in the prep lab. So we have a lot of researchers who work here with me, and volunteers. I should mention that Trish is the greatest volunteer that we will ever have. And she is also single-handedly responsible for basically keeping this collection in any way research worthy, especially as Owen and Bridger kind of got overwhelmed in the last couple of years that they were working here. So this is the prep lab that I'm standing in now. Our preparator is a woman named Kaye Whitman. Kaye is a really phenomenal preparator, especially for really, really small specimens. Rodents, primates, she is a kind of Cenozoic small mammal specialist, but she also likes working on the big stuff. Sorry, now I'm pacing around because I realized that we are getting ready to put the beautiful skull on display. That's why it's not in the back. This is the skull of Smilodectes. This is that same skull that I showed us, that we initially discovered, that I showed you the time lapse of getting the block out. This is what was in that block. So initially we just saw like this side of the skull was exposed on the surface, and this is what the whole thing looks like. So it's an animal that has a much shorter snout than Netharctus. It looks a little bit more like a shafak, which are those like lemurs that bounce around on their back legs. Again, here's the post-orbital bar going along in the back of the head. And this animal has this really, you can see its brain back here. Another thing, obviously, that primates have that makes us different than lots of other mammals is we have really big brains. And for some reason, Smilodectes has this really big set of sinuses, which are basically holes in the skull or in the bone that give it like this big forehead that kind of gives it this like short snout. And we don't really know why it has all this air in the front of its head that eventually in later primates gets filled in with brain. But Smilodectes is this animal that kind of short snouted, large eyes, possibly like a ephemeral nocturnal animal. And we have beautiful teeth preserved in this thing too. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous specimen. And along with it, we find things like it also has this skeleton, upper arm bone here. This is the humerus. This is where the elbow joint is. And really important for finding primates, the big plate of bone here on the side of the humerus and this big knob of bone here on the edge of the elbow are where the muscles attach that basically help us flex our wrists and then grab with our fingers, all attached there. So if you find just like this much of the bone of a primate, you can also tell you're dealing with a primate, because you're dealing with animals with a powerful grasp. It's really happy to be in the trees. So having both those pieces of evidence, we have like the rest of the skeleton that's being prepared right now. We have these creatures. So this is a Madagascar specimen. This is an animal called Paleopropithecus. Paleopropithecus is something that's called the sloth lemur for maybe obvious reasons. It is a kind of German shepherd-sized lemur that once climbed through the forests of Madagascar. The youngest specimens of this have been radiocarbon dated to about 300 years old. And there's a creature in folklore of Madagascar called the tre-tre-tre, or cha-cha-cha. And the cha-cha-cha is this like kind of goblin creature that has long claws and long arms and kind of a human-like face. And a lot of lemurs in Malagasy are named based on the sounds that they make. So shafak is an imitation. They make this like kind of sound when they call to each other. And so shafak is a way to kind of like approximate that. So we think like is the sound that giant sloth lemurs would have made when they called to each other. So it's kind of cool that we actually have kind of a paleo sound recovered in the folklore of Madagascar before these animals went extinct.
Thanks for that, Matt. Are there any other questions from the membership?
So just as a teacher, I want to say I've been teaching virtually. And so Matt reminds me so much, like at the end of class, the child who wants to show and tell you all the cool things in their house that you never get to see.
Exactly.
So I thank you. That was great.
Well, with any luck, we'll actually get to see some of this in person in the not too distant future.
Yes.
We've been saying that for several months now, haven't we, Matt?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and when this exhibit at least is done and we can have people in, I will definitely let the Fossil Club know how to come and see this person.
Yeah, we would be delighted. Yes, Diane, are you? Oh, you're clapping. Thank you. I thought you were having a question. All right. Thanks very much, Matt, for joining us today and asking that question about what makes a primate. I had never considered the fact that there might be really physiological, really identifiable physiological differences in the bone structure that would be so clear. But not only that you would see fossil evidence of almost a progression from some of those more intermediate kinds of animals. So I really enjoyed that. I also just wanted to announce to the membership that in recognition of the relationship that the longtime relationship that has existed between the North Carolina Fossil Club and the Duke Lemur Center, the board voted to donate to the Duke Lemur Center the volumes that we've published about the North Carolina fossils. Was there anything you wanted to say about that, Trish or Matt?
This was going to be done in person had we had a real live meeting.
Yeah.
But I believe Gary has brought over the other volumes that our Fossil Club has presented. And another thing, Gary, I've looked around and I couldn't find all those brochures from our Fossil Club that Matt would like to give out. So Gary, if you're hearing me, could you get those over to Matt at some time? And
yes,
Matt.
Yeah, I definitely have some in my closet where we keep all the publications.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're delighted to be able to support the DLC in such a way.
Yeah.
And
I think Matt was muted, but I think he was trying to say something.
I'm just saying thank you because we have them and have used them because part of I'm trying to become more involved in understanding, like I said, I'm originally from Cincinnati and I've done all this work in Africa and Madagascar and Western North America. I want to learn about the rocks under my feet and along in North Carolina, because I want to make the connection between what's going on in these really remote exotic places versus what's going on right here at home when I go in and work with student groups and work with Fossil Club, and also just because I'm curious about it. So hopefully I will be popping up more often at fossil collecting trips and excursions to just better understand the geology of North Carolina, to help put it in the context of this other kind of more exotic stuff that's behind me. And so having those books along is really helping me, because I definitely don't know my sharks and mollusks as well as I should.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, thanks very much, Matt. You're welcome to stay